No one at the playground knew Naomi Cole used to talk armed men out of doorways for a living. By the time the ambulance left, one father would recognize the exact words she'd once used to save someone else's life. Because they were the reason his son was still breathing to hear them. Naomi Cole had exactly 4 minutes of peace on a park bench before the screaming started. Theo was 30 feet away, mid-negotiation with another 6-year-old over whose turn it was on the yellow slide. Naomi had her coffee, her phone unopened in her bag, and the particular stillness of a Saturday morning that came maybe twice a month. Then a boy on the climbing dome, 7, maybe 8, dark-haired, reaching for the top bar. Lost his grip and came down hard on his shoulder and the side of his head. And didn't get up. She was moving before she'd finished setting the coffee down. Caleb, a man near the bench closest to the dome, was already running. Faster than the fall should have allowed anyone to react. And he reached the boy 2 steps ahead of Naomi and scooped him up off the mulch in one motion. Too fast, too rough for a simple fall. The kind of movement that came from somewhere other than parental panic. Mulch chips scattered where his knees hit the ground. And he had the boy's head cradled against his shoulder before Naomi had covered half the distance between them. The boy, Caleb, apparently, was crying now, a good sign in itself, breath coming in ragged gulps rather than silence. His father's hands, though, weren't shaking like most parents' hands did in the first 10 seconds of a scare like this. They were fast, precise, checking the back of Caleb's skull with 2 fingers. In a motion that looked almost clinical before catching himself and pulling the boy tighter instead. "Sir, let me look at him," Naomi said, closing the distance. "I'm a nurse." The man, 30s, broad through the shoulders, a faded unit tattoo visible below his rolled sleeve, didn't hand the boy over. His eyes weren't on Naomi. They were scanning the crowd gathering behind her, fast, wide. The specific kind of scanning that had nothing to do with counting witnesses. And everything to do with counting exits. "Get back," he said, low, to no one in particular. And took 1 step backward with the boy still in his arms. That was when Brenda Sykes, mother of the girl Theo had been negotiating slide turns with, grabbed her own daughter by the wrist and started shouting, "Someone call 911. He's not letting anyone near that kid." He practically tackled him. Her phone was already up, recording. "I saw him grab him. That's not normal. That man is not okay." "Ma'am, stop," Naomi said, sharper than she meant to. But Brenda's voice was already climbing. And climbing voices did the wrong thing to a man who was scanning a crowd like it might turn into something worse than a crowd. "I'm not going to just stand here," Brenda snapped back, not lowering the phone. "Somebody has to document this in case." "In case what?" Naomi didn't wait for an answer. A small crowd had gathered in the loose, gravitational way crowds did around anything that looked like trouble. A dozen phones, worth of attention pressing in from every side. And every one of those angles made the man's shoulders climb another half-inch toward his ears. Caleb's arm, visible over his father's shoulder, was starting to swell. A raised red welt blooming fast along the forearm, too fast for a scrape from the fall. Naomi's stomach dropped a half-second before her brain caught up. Something on that equipment had stung him on the way down. And swelling that moved that quickly wasn't just swelling. Across the playground, Theo had stopped mid-argument over the slide and was staring. One hand still on the ladder rail, his face going carefully blank. The look he got when he couldn't tell if something was a game or not. Naomi caught his eye for half a second, a look she hoped read as "I see you, stay there," and turned back before she could spare it any longer. "Sir," Naomi said again, dropping her voice instead of raising it. Flattening it into something with no edges left to grab onto. "My name is Naomi. I need you to let me see his arm. Not take him. Just see it." The man's eyes finally landed on her, and for a second they didn't look dangerous at all. They looked like a man drowning in a version of this moment that had happened to him before, somewhere much worse than a playground. "He's fine," he said, though it came out more question than answer, aimed at himself as much as at her. "He fell. Kids fall. They do, Naomi agreed, matching his pace, not correcting him, not yet. And that arm's telling me something else happened too. I'm not going to take him from you. I just need 2 seconds with my eyes on it. Somewhere behind her, Brenda's voice pitched higher again, something about somebody actually doing something. And Naomi felt the man's attention flicker back toward the noise, his jaw tightening. The exits recalculating themselves behind his eyes all over again. She'd seen that flicker before, a long time ago, on men standing in doorways. With a lot more than a scraped-up kid on the line. It had a rhythm to it, the count, the reset, the count again. And the only thing that ever interrupted the rhythm was a voice steady enough to give the counting somewhere else to land. Dean, he said, distracted, like the introduction cost him something. Dean Correa. He still hadn't loosened his grip on his son, but he'd stopped backing away. Which Naomi counted as the only win available to her in the next 5 seconds. Dean, I need you to look at me, not at them. She kept her voice level, unhurried. The register she hadn't used on purpose in 11 years and hadn't forgotten how to find. Caleb got stung. His arm's swelling fast, which means we don't have long. Before it gets a lot more serious than a bump on the head. I need to see him. That's the only thing that matters right now. Behind her, Brenda hadn't stopped narrating into her phone. He's talking to her like she's negotiating a hostage situation. Is anyone else seeing this? Somebody get her to back up, Naomi said, without turning around, to whichever bystander wanted to be useful. A man in a gray hoodie finally stepped between Brenda and the scene, murmuring something Naomi didn't catch. It bought maybe 10 feet of distance and a few decibels of quiet, which was more than she'd had 30 seconds earlier. I'm not the enemy here, Brenda called past him anyway, though quieter now. Some of the certainty draining out of her voice now that no one was agreeing with it out loud. I'm just trying to keep everyone safe. Then help me keep him calm instead of narrating him into a corner, Naomi said. Not looking back, already crouching in front of Dean again. It wasn't kind, but it wasn't meant to be, it was meant to be heard, and it was. Dean lowered Caleb slowly onto the bench, one hand still braced under his son's back. Like letting go entirely wasn't a function his body currently had access to. The welt on Caleb's forearm had spread to the size of a fist, angry and hot. And his breathing had gone thin and high, a faint wheeze catching at the top of each inhale. His lips, Naomi noted with a fresh spike of urgency, had taken on the faintest gray cast at the edges. Does he carry an EpiPen? Naomi asked. In the diaper bag? No, backpack, it's. Dean's hands went to his own pockets first, uselessly, before his brain caught up with the question. He grabbed the backpack off the bench and yanked at the wrong zipper twice, fingers clumsy, before he found the right one. Front pocket. Blue zipper. Sorry, it's. He stopped himself, jaw tight. Not again, he muttered, barely audible, like the words belonged to a different day entirely. Naomi found it in 4 seconds and had the cap off in 5, talking the whole time in the same flat, steady rhythm. I'm going to give this to him now, okay? It's going to hurt for a second, then it's going to help. You don't have to do anything except keep holding his hand. Wait, is that? Dean's eyes were on the auto-injector now, tracking it as he'd tracked the crowd a minute earlier. Some old triage instinct fighting through the panic. That's epinephrine. That's for anaphylaxis. That's exactly what this is, Naomi said, not slowing down. You know the word for it, that tells me you've been through this training before. Which means some part of you already knows I'm not doing anything wrong here. Hold his leg still for me. The epinephrine went into Caleb's outer thigh through his shorts. He yelped, more startled than hurt, and Dean flinched at the sound like it had gone into him instead. For a second his hand hovered over the injection site like he wanted to pull it back out. Some deep reflex distrustful of anything sharp near his son. And then he made himself hold still instead. Count with me, Naomi said, watching Caleb's chest for the wheeze to start easing. 1, 2. Slow breath in on 3. Dean counted along under his breath without seeming to notice he was doing it. his own breathing slowing to match the rhythm she'd set. And for a few seconds the three of them existed inside that count and nothing else. Not the crowd, not the phone still recording somewhere behind them, not whatever was still approaching down the street. Then Caleb's next breath caught halfway in, a thin, strangled sound. And Dean's whole body snapped rigid again. That's not better, that sounded worse. Why does that sound worse? It's the medication working through his system, not a setback, Naomi said. Not breaking rhythm even as her own eyes stayed locked on Caleb's chest. Give it 30 more seconds before you panic on his behalf. Keep counting. He kept counting. On the fourth cycle, the wheeze finally loosened, audibly, and some of the gray eased out of Caleb's lips. A siren rose somewhere 2 streets over, still distant. And Dean's whole body went rigid at the sound in a way that had nothing to do with his son. That's for you, Naomi said quickly, low. For him. Nobody's coming for you, Dean. Stay with me. He didn't look reassured. His breathing had picked up to match his son's, shallow and fast. And his eyes had gone somewhere that wasn't the park bench anymore, somewhere with a different kind of siren in it. You don't know that, he said, quiet, almost to himself. You don't know who's coming. I don't, Naomi agreed. But I know Caleb needs his father steady for the next 10 minutes more than he needs anything else. And I know you can be steady even when you don't feel like you can. You've done harder things than this. A patrol car rounded the corner of the park a minute later, well ahead of the ambulance. Lights on, no siren now that it was close. Naomi watched Dean's hands curl into fists at his sides. Watched the exits count start behind his eyes all over again. And understood that the easy part of this morning was already over. The officer who got out of the patrol car was young, maybe 5 years on the job. Hand resting near his belt in a way that wasn't quite on his weapon and wasn't quite not. He scanned the scene fast. A man crouched over a child on a bench, a small crowd, a woman with her phone still half raised. And his own posture shifted into something more careful, more braced. In a way that mirrored Dean's without either man noticing it. Trent Malloy, PD. Dispatch got a call about a man assaulting a child. Nobody's being assaulted, Naomi said. Stepping into the space between Malloy and Dean before either man had finished deciding what the other one was. This is Caleb's father. Caleb had an anaphylactic reaction after a fall. I administered his epinephrine 2 minutes ago and he needs transport, now, before the second wave hits. And you are? Naomi Cole. RN, Ashgrove General. I've got a medkit signature and a witness list of about 20 people who'll back up the timeline, if you need it. Right now I need you to not need it yet. Ma'am, I need to speak with him directly. You can speak with him. You don't need your hand on your belt to do it. Naomi kept her voice exactly where it had been for Dean, flat, unhurried, no edges. Because the trick had never been having 2 different voices for 2 different men. It was refusing to let either one talk her into raising it. He's a combat veteran. Sirens, crowds, and a stranger's hand near a weapon are not neutral inputs for him right now. I need you to lower your hand, say your name, and ask him one calm question. That's it. Malloy's jaw worked, but his hand came off his belt. Sir, I'm Officer Malloy. Can you tell me what happened to your son? Dean's answer came out clipped, disjointed, half facts assembled out of order. The dome, the fall, the sting, someone yelling. But it came out, and Malloy wrote nothing down, just listened. And something in his shoulders eased half a degree. Then Caleb, still on the bench, let out a thin, wet cough that didn't sound like the last one. And Dean lurched toward him fast enough that Malloy's hand snapped back to his belt on pure reflex. Hands where I can see them, Malloy said, sharper now, the calm gone out of his voice in half a second. He's checking his son's airway, Naomi said. Stepping into the narrowing gap between them, close enough now that Malloy would have to go through her to reach for anything. That's not a threat, officer. That's a father whose kid just made a sound he didn't like. Look at where his hands actually are, on Caleb, not on you, not on me, not on anyone. Malloy's eyes flicked down, confirmed it, and his hand eased off the belt a second time, slower this time. Like it cost him something to trust it. "Copy," he said, quiet, mostly to himself. Dean's hands were shaking now, badly. Adrenaline finally catching up with him at the worst possible moment for it. And he pressed them flat against his own thighs like he could will them still through sheer pressure. I wasn't going to do anything," he said, to Malloy, to the crowd, to no one specific. "I just needed everyone to back up so I could think." "I know," Naomi said. "You did the right thing. You're still doing it." Brenda, still hovering at the edge of the loose crowd with her daughter's hand in hers, had gone quiet somewhere in the last minute, watching the three of them with an expression that had started to look less like certainty and more like doubt. She lowered her phone the rest of the way, finally, though she didn't put it away. The ambulance arrived 90 seconds later. The paramedics had Caleb on the gurney and moving before Naomi finished the handoff report. EPI time, dose, reaction onset, rattled off in the clean, clipped cadence of someone who'd given 100 handoffs before this one. "Wheeze is worsening," the lead paramedic said, listening to Caleb's chest. "He may need a second dose before we're at the hospital. Dad's riding with us." Naomi rattled off the field report a second time for the transport chart, unprompted. Because handoffs bore repeating twice more than most people assumed. Onset time, dose given, route, response observed. The paramedic nodded along without slowing his hands, already threading a second IV line as the gurney rolled. Dean didn't move. He was staring at the gurney like getting in the vehicle required crossing a distance much larger than 4 feet of pavement. "Dean." Naomi caught his eyes and held them. The way she used to hold a voice on the other end of a phone line steady across a door that hadn't opened yet. "He needs you next to him more than he needs you steady. You don't have to be steady. You just have to be there." "What if I can't?" He stopped himself, jaw tight, like the sentence had gotten away from him before he could stop it from being honest. "You will," Naomi said. "Because the version of you that can't is going to sit down next to your son. And let his hand hold onto yours instead of the other way around. That's still there. That works too." He got in. Naomi found Theo, ashen-faced and quiet at the edge of the crowd, where a neighbor had been keeping half an eye on him, and crouched down to his level before anything else. "You okay, bug? You sounded different," Theo said. "Your voice." "I know." She smoothed his hair back, checking his face for the particular blankness. That meant a 6-year-old was about to cry and hadn't decided yet. He wasn't there. He was just watching her, working something out. "Was that your work voice?" "Kind of," Naomi said. Which wasn't a lie so much as the truth cut down to a size a 6-year-old could carry. "It's a voice for when people are scared. It helps them hear me better." It didn't sound scared. "That's the whole point of it, bug." She didn't have a better answer than that yet. Her sister arrived 11 minutes later, breathless from cutting a Saturday morning short. And Naomi handed off a subdued, watchful Theo with a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. Then, because there wasn't a version of this morning where she didn't, she got in her own car and followed the ambulance to Ashgrove General, the hospital where she'd clocked out 14 hours earlier, still in yesterday's ponytail. Still smelling faintly of playground mulch and epinephrine. The drive took 6 minutes. It felt considerably longer. Naomi found them in Bay 6. Badging herself past the triage desk with a nod to a charge nurse who clearly wanted to ask why she was there on a Saturday in jeans. And knew better than to ask it yet. Caleb was pale against the gurney sheets, an IV taped to the back of one small hand. Dean folded into the visitor chair like his body had finally run out of adrenaline to keep him upright. Caleb's second wave came in the bay the way the paramedic had warned it might. The wheeze sharpening, hives spreading up his neck. Oxygen saturation sliding from 96 to 91 in the space of a doorway. Dr. Elena Voss ordered a second epinephrine dose and a steroid taper without looking up from the monitor. And within 10 minutes his breathing had eased back into something that didn't make the room hold still to listen for it. Dean's hand hadn't left his son's the entire time, though his knuckles had gone white enough that Naomi wondered if he'd notice the ache later, once the day finally let him. He'll need 4 hours of observation minimum, given the biphasic risk, Dr. Voss said. But he's stable. Good reaction to the EPI. Good timing on the field dose. Whoever gave that first shot bought him the only margin he had. Dean, sitting in the chair beside the bed with his son's hand in his, looked up at that like he was hearing it for the first time, though Naomi had told him twice already at the park. "You did that," he said to her. "At the park. That was you. That was both of us," Naomi said. "You held his leg still when I needed it held. That matters more than people think it does." Dr. Voss glanced between them, catching some fraction of the morning's shape without needing the whole story explained to her. And let it go without comment. One of the quieter mercies of a job that saw 100 half-told stories a week. She moved on to the next bed with a final nod at the monitor numbers, satisfied. Malloy had followed them in, technically for the report, and stood near the curtain rather than in it, closer to a witness now than an officer. Which Naomi suspected was its own kind of apology he didn't have the words for yet. "For what it's worth," he said, mostly to Dean. "The way you answered those questions back there, that wasn't nothing. Lot of people freeze up worse than that." Dean didn't answer him. He was still looking at Naomi. "That voice you used," he said. "The flat one. No rise, no drop." His jaw worked. He seemed to run out of the sentence before he finished it, and started again smaller. "I had a guy talk to me like that once. Worse day than this. Nurses don't do that voice. I'd know. Spent 4 months in a VA hospital around people who do and don't have it." "No," Naomi agreed. "It's not a nurse thing." "Then what is it?" She glanced at Theo's empty spot by the door out of habit, then back at Dean. And decided the truth cost less than continuing to manage around it. "I was an Army SID negotiator for 6 years. Doorways, mostly. A few rooftops." She said it the way she'd said everything else that morning, flat, no performance in it. "I don't do it anymore. Haven't needed to in a long time, until about an hour ago." "Why'd you stop?" It wasn't a question strangers usually got to ask. But Dean wasn't asking as a stranger anymore, and Naomi found she didn't mind answering like he wasn't one. "Lost someone I couldn't talk down. Only time in 6 years it didn't work." She kept her voice as flat over that sentence as she had over every other one that morning. "Though it cost considerably more. After that I wanted a job where the worst thing that could happen to somebody was still usually fixable. Nursing does that, most days." "Most days," Dean repeated, quiet, like he understood what lived in the gap of that phrase. Dean absorbed the rest of it in silence for a moment. Something shifting behind his eyes that looked less like surprise and more like a door closing on a question he'd been circling since the park. "You didn't sound like someone who hadn't needed it in a long time." "It doesn't really leave," Naomi said. "It just waits." "Yeah." He looked down at Caleb, asleep now, chest rising even and unbothered. "I know something about that too." Malloy, still near the curtain, cleared his throat. "For the report. I'm going to write this up as a medical response, not an incident." "There's no incident here. Wanted you both to hear that before I write it, not after." "Thank you," Dean said. And meant it enough that his voice caught slightly on the second word. He looked down at his own hands, steadier now than they'd been at the park. And turned them over once like he was checking they still belonged to him. "People usually handle me," he said, "not quite to anyone. Quiet. Not much left in the tank behind it. Careful voices. Real careful." He shook his head slightly, like he didn't have the rest of the thought yet, and it took him a second to find it. "You weren't careful. Just honest. Fast." A short breath. "Different thing." "Careful and honest aren't always the same job," Naomi agreed. "Careful protects the person talking. Honest protects the person listening. I only ever learned how to do the second one." Brenda Sykes found Naomi at the nurse's station 2 hours later. Her daughter trailing behind her with a juice box. Her phone conspicuously absent from her hand for the first time all morning. "I looked up anaphylaxis timing after I got home. Read that a fall and a sting close together can look like a lot of things that aren't what they actually are." She twisted the strap of her daughter's backpack in her hands. I filmed a man having the worst morning of his year and called it an assault. I don't know how to undo posting that. You can delete it, Naomi said, not unkindly. That's the whole undo there is. Would you have done anything differently? If it were your kid? I'd have wanted somebody to ask what was actually happening before deciding what they were looking at. Naomi didn't make it a bigger moment than it needed to be. Brenda hadn't been cruel, only frightened and loud, in the way fear made people. And there wasn't a version of today's lesson that needed her humiliated on top of learning it. Brenda nodded slowly, chastened but not performing it, which Naomi found she respected more than an apology would have earned. My daughter asked me on the way home why I yelled at the man instead of helping him. I didn't have a good answer for her either. Maybe that's the one worth sitting with, Naomi said. Not for my sake, for hers. Brenda's daughter tugged her sleeve, bored and ready to leave. And Brenda let herself be pulled toward the exit with a small, unfinished nod that wasn't quite goodbye. Naomi went back to check Caleb's monitor. Sat holding at 98, steady. And was still standing at his bedside when Malloy found her 20 minutes later. He stopped by before his shift ended, notebook still out of habit. Though the report was long since filed as what it was, a medical emergency, no charges, no further action. Department's going to use the call as a training example, he said. How dispatch language shapes response before an officer's even out of the car. Man assaulting a child, gets you a hand near a weapon. Father, panicked, possible medical episode, gets you a different guy walking up. He hesitated. Wanted you to know that part actually goes somewhere. Caleb was discharged that evening, breathing clear. An allergy referral in hand and a very serious conversation ahead of his family. About EPIPENS living in every bag, every car, every backpack from now on. Dean walked him out in a wheelchair he didn't need but the hospital required. Naomi beside them out of habit more than duty. Her shift not even technically starting for another 16 hours. At the doors, Dean stopped. The negotiator thing. You going to go back to it? No, Naomi said. I'm going to go back to being a nurse who used to be one. That's not the same as pretending it never happened. It's just where I actually live now. That's a hell of a skill to waste. It's not wasted. It just doesn't need a doorway to be useful. She looked at Caleb, half asleep already against his father's arm. It needed a Saturday morning instead. Dean shifted his son's weight. The wheelchair's rented wheels catching briefly on the seam of the entryway tile. And didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood there working up to it. The way a man does when he knows the sentence is going to cost him something. Guess I owe you a version of thanks big enough for that. You don't owe me anything, Naomi said. You held still when I asked you to, twice. When every instinct in you was built to do the opposite. That's not nothing either. She watched them go, then went to find her sister and her son. WHO had 100 questions about her voice that she was, for the first time in 11 years, ready to actually answer. Theo was building a tower out of the break room's spare paper cups when she found him. Methodical and unbothered. The total recovery only a 6-year-old manages by dinner time. He looked up when she crouched beside him. Is the boy okay? He's okay. Going home tonight. Are you going to use that voice again? Naomi thought about that longer than the question probably warranted. Only if somebody needs it, she said. But yeah, probably. I don't think it's going anywhere. Theo considered this with the total seriousness of a child. Deciding whether a piece of information changed anything important. Then went back to his cups, apparently satisfied. Naomi sat down on the floor beside him and stayed there a while. In no hurry at all to be anywhere else. I didn't write this to suggest that every man who looks frightening in a crisis is secretly a hero. Or that every panicked bystander is secretly a villain. Most people, in the worst 30 seconds of someone else's day, are simply reacting to what they think they're seeing, and what they think they're seeing is rarely the whole picture. This is a story about the gap between those two things. What a scene looks like from the outside, and what's actually happening to the person living inside it. Naomi didn't need her old training to save Caleb's life. A nurse without that background could have given the same epinephrine. What the training gave her was the ability to keep everyone else's fear from making a hard morning into a tragedy. That's a skill available to more of us than we think, and it rarely announces itself. It usually just sounds like someone choosing to lower their voice instead of raising it.